Welcome back, everyone. Dr. Jerry McGill will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Brian Greene. Jerry, please take it away.
Thank you, Darlene. It's a great pleasure indeed to say hello to you, Brian, and to be able to have the honor of introducing you at this prestigious symposium today. After Brian presents, we'll have a little time, 5 minutes or so, for some questions before we segue into the facilitated discussion with Professor Danks. Let me introduce Brian by saying that he is the Director of Technology and Ethics at the Marcula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara. He's been there now for a few years as a director. He did his PhD in Ethics and Social Theory at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. His book that is just about to come out is warm to my heart. It deals with transhumanism and religion, which is an area I teach here at Duquesne University. But he has a surprising new book under contract. It's called Space Ethics. And that reflects a lot of the work that he's done on some fascinating topics like rapid space settlement. He's obviously very engaged in astrobiology as well as AI technology. And an area of his own writing that may very well pervade much of the advice he can give us is from an old bloke from distant past, as they say in Scotland, Aristotle, who gave us a lot of wisdom, techne and wisdom. And that might be something Brian will encourage us forward with. Brian?
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here, and I am glad to be talking today about this subject. So I want to start off talking about two quotes from Pope Francis. If you can advance to the next slide, please. So, and this just came out in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which means brothers and sisters all. So religious believers, including Christians, can be caught up in networks of verbal violence through the internet. In other words, I mean, you don't really need to have other words, right? It's pretty obvious that the internet is giving us bad opportunities to interact with each other, and we need to figure out ways to solve this problem. However, the internet also, as you know, many people have been saying so far, also gives us benefits in terms of the immense possibilities that it gives. So this is something truly good, a gift from God, he says in the same encyclical later on. I'd like to start with basically an outline of what I'm talking about today. We're going to be talking about misinformation, disinformation, and lies, talk about our contemporary problem, exactly what has been going on here. Then we're going to talk about teleology. So as Professor McGill was talking about, yes, there is some teleology here, which connects back to Aristotle, of course. And then it's the question of what can we do? So we already know that social media is driving us into filter bubbles. We've had plenty of discussion of this already. It's a huge problem. And we've already had misinformation and disinformation defined for each other. Misinformation just being falsehoods, intentional or not, and disinformation has an intention behind it. It's intentionally deceptive. And there's an old word for this. It's called a lie. So telling a falsehood with the intent to deceive has been understood to be something which is bad for thousands of years. This is not a new problem, right? We have a commandment about it in Christianity and Judaism. Most religions have some sort of commandment or other sorts of directives or guidance about this problem. And so, you know, we don't have to look at this as being something totally new, right? We can look back and say, we already have long traditions saying there's something really bad happening here. And one of the reasons lies are bad is because they destroy social trust. So the internet lets everyone in the world with strange views find each other and form a gang with these echo chambers that we've been talking about. And then they end up fighting each other and fighting against reality. And it's not just, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the political side of these things, but it's a lot more than that too. There's all sorts of other strange conspiracy theories out there, like the earth is flat or that it's hollow, or geocentrism, which of course is very old. Chemtrails, as though airplanes were spraying us with chemicals and stuff like that. The fake moon landings. And some of the strange, maybe the strangest one that I can think of, the idea that there are alien reptile lizards running the government. So yeah, there's really strange stuff out there. So there's something here that has to do with basic human psychology. People form groups based on their beliefs, and this is a pretty strange thing when you think about it. They can be metaphysical beliefs, they can be moral beliefs, they can be stylistic beliefs, they can be behavioral beliefs and expectations. And this is a really strange thing. I don't know if you can see it very well there, but that's a picture of some people who are dressed up in a very goth sort of way. I want to say they're not strange at all. What's strange is human beings in general. Humans are very unusual creatures in that we form groups based on our beliefs. And that's a very interesting thing also. You can look at religion, ideology, politics, individual political issues like abortion and gun rights. People get very, very dedicated to particular issues, and then we let that form a group around us. And the result is that because of technology, we fragment into smaller and smaller groups with stranger and stranger beliefs. So here's a picture of one of these lizard overlords that is running the government, supposedly. So our contemporary problem really has a lot to do with basic ethics of technology. Technology gives us powers that we have never had before. So with these new powers, all of a sudden we have choices that we've never had to make before. And each one of these new choices gives us a possibility or could be a potentially ethically charged choice. So these new choices, once again, they could be, because they can be ethically charged, they have the potential to break us into groups. Every new choice gives us the possibility to splinter into new groups. So for example, we've already talked about pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine before vaccines were invented. That wasn't a choice people had to make. There's also, of course, embryonic stem cell research, pro and against, cloning, pro and against, human enhancement, as Dr. McGill was saying previously on that question of transhumanism. There are some people who are very in favor of it, and of course, people who are very against it. Pro-surveillance and anti-surveillance, it depends on who's doing the surveilling, partly, and whether you trust them or not. Pro and anti-AI, and this politicization is coming, and of course, it goes on and on. And this is producing kind of a socio-political fracturing coming from technology. In other words, technology is not only accelerating our division through social media, but it's also giving us more things to be divided about. And I think that's something that's really unique to the situation that we're in now. It's not only accelerating everything, but just general technological change is giving us more and more things to be divided about. Part of that has to do with the rapidity of things, because theoretically, after a while, we should start to settle on issues, but we might not. We're not sure. We can't predict the future, of course. So once again, this gets into questions of basic human psychology. We trust people who are committed to our group, and we distrust people who are not committed. Therefore, as groups multiply in number and shrink in size, we're going to trust fewer and fewer people. And therefore, widespread trust is being destroyed. And it's not only those reasons, of course. There are many other reasons that this is happening in our society today. And you can trace this, I mean, over the course of history, of course, trust gains and decreases. But we're experiencing what we have right now is definitely a large social decrease in trust. So now we're going to talk about teleology. Teleology is the study of purposes and goals and ends and what's the point, the meaning of things, that sort of thing. So we'll talk about the purpose of trust, technology, true information, disinformation, and misinformation. And I think some of these are a little bit strange. So we'll talk about what exactly is strange about them. So what's the purpose of trust? Trust builds confidence. It builds loyalty, commitment. It builds faith, it builds community, it builds a group out of individuals, and it makes groups strong. So once again, there's something there about belief. A shared belief can really build trust, and then there's a group that's built out of that, and depending on how strongly that belief is held, it can be a very strong group. Part of the reason that trust exists is that people form long-lasting, caring relationships. And this, you can look at this anthropologically speaking. Humans have long lives. We have long childhoods where we are dependent on others. We also have long years where we can be elderly and dependent on others' care, or we can be injured and need others' care. This is something that is deep in human nature. And you can think about this with any team. They talk about trust building. That's a thing with teams, right? You build trust because you want the team to trust each other so that they all know that they're strong and can ultimately get what they need. So trust strengthens relationships and it makes cooperative life a lot easier. And distrust does the opposite. If we can't trust people, we're much less effective at what we do and we get a lot less done. Distrust ruins groups and causes them to fall apart. And that's something that we really need to be thinking about with some intensity right now as we're watching what's happening in our country and around the world. The purpose of technology is another one. Interestingly, technology is a lot like trust in that it makes things easier and more workable. Technology gives us a greater scope of action. That means that there are more things that we can do. It gives us greater efficiency of action, which means that the things that we choose to do, we can choose to do much more effectively. And it's just easier to get things done. It also gives greater determination of outcome, which means you're more likely to get the outcome that you want. There's less probability involved in things. The background picture here is the Panama Canal. And of course, if you go back 2,000 years in time, the Panama Canal was not something that anyone had in their mind. But once you get to around the year 1900 or so, all of a sudden this becomes a possibility. It falls within the scope of human action. We have the tools that are efficient enough to do this, and we have greater determination of outcome. They started a couple times on the Panama Canal, and one of the times they failed. They didn't make it. They ran out of money. But after a while, the technology got to the level where it was a determination of outcome, where you could definitely get what you wanted. So in other words, technology gives power. You can look at the entire history of weapons development, war, industrialization, and so on to demonstrate this in a very obvious way. But that's not the only kind of power. There's also agricultural power, medical technology, communications, transportation, and much more mundane technologies that give power too. This entire conference today is because of communications technology and information technology and computers and machine learning and artificial intelligence and all those things that are in play in terms of spreading misinformation or making social networks function. All those things are built very much in just the ability to communicate with each other and speed things up and make that communication fast and very, very large scale. So ever since the 1940s, nuclear weapons and over time, people started realizing more about the environmental crisis. They've really revolutionized the way that we understand human action in the world. We used to exercise a very different level of power than we do now. So more power means more need for ethics, kind of as we discussed before. There are more choices, and what used to be involuntarily constrained by human weakness, we now have to learn to be voluntarily restrained by our own judgment and our ethics. In other words, just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. And then with the should comes the should or should we not. And we've seen this very clearly, I think, with social media. The should that they've been operating on, of course, is making money, returning shareholder value, and not only such greedy motivations as that, but also a very fundamental human motivation. People want to talk to each other. We want to communicate. There's something good about being able to reach out to our friends and find out how people are doing and just keeping up with our own friends. But then the question is, how should we be doing that? So technology, power, and efficiency, we need to learn to be efficient at good, and we need to be efficient, or inefficient rather, at bad things or evil things, or we're going to create a terrible world. This is the ultimate kind of large scale we have to be thinking about, which is that if we don't make ourselves efficient at good and inefficient at evil, the world's going to become a terrible place. And it's not a place that anybody wants to live in. Social media companies don't want to live there. Billionaires, tech workers, people don't want to live in a terrible world. And so we have to figure out how can we actually use our power and efficiency towards creating a world that we actually want to live in. So then how can we use technology to make good efficient and evil inefficient? And when it comes to facts and the information ecosystem, how can technology make facts and truth efficient and misinformation and disinformation inefficient? So what's the purpose of true information? The purpose of facts and truth and true information is to proportionally match the human mind to reality. That goes to Aquinas, and of course it has much deeper roots than that. Aquinas talks about it in his Treatise de Veritate, but this is an old idea, right? The purpose of truth, of seeking truth and rationality ultimately, is to make sure that the human mind matches reality. Now, why do we want to do that? What good is being mentally attuned to reality? There are several senses at play there. Biologically, it means survival. If we don't get the right facts about food or about predators or things like that, it could lead to our death. Socially speaking, failure to match social reality could lead to harm, death, reproductive failure, things like that. Scientifically speaking, falsehoods don't work. So if science is fundamentally something that works, it gets you true information that is verifiable over and over again repeatably, then falsehoods don't do that. And technologically speaking, technology is not built upon reality fails. And so if we're talking about engineering, then that engineering technology needs to be built upon something that is real and truthful. So the purpose of truth is ultimately survival. And we should assume then that the opposite of truth, falsehoods, could lead to the opposite of survival, which is harm and death. In other words, this is very serious stuff. Just looking at our own context in the United States, we're being attacked by enemies who want to harm and kill us. And if you look at the COVID pandemic, that perpetuation of misinformation and disinformation ultimately kills people. And if we weren't having that problem, maybe fewer Americans would be dead. We can't run the experiment over again, but we can look for correlations that might have led to some of these very negative things happening. And that's ultimately what lies do. They aim to harm or even kill people, and they break trust along the way. There's a saying that violence kills the body, but lies kill the mind. Lies prevent us from working in a society, even individually or as a group in society, working together towards a common goal. Now, what is the purpose of disinformation? Disinformation intentionally misleads people in order to lead them into error. So once again, it has a harmful element to it. You're trying to harm people ultimately. It sows discord, destroys trust, it destroys group, and it weakens target groups in power competitions. And that's something that we should really be thinking about, is that there are power competitions going on in the world at a very large scale, geopolitically speaking. And if you can weaken your opposing groups, then you relatively make yourself stronger. So the purpose of disinformation is basically to weaken enemies, sowing discord of every type, political, religious, ideological, behavioral, scientific or unscientific. And you can think about it this way: Russia doesn't need to gain strength in an objective sense if it can weaken America and thereby gain strength in a relative sense. Power is always relative. And if you're in a situation in your country where you don't feel like you can dramatically increase your own power, then what you do is you find that pivot point, that leverage point, where you can instead weaken your opponents and thereby in the competition make yourself stronger. Now here's kind of a funny category. What is the purpose of misinformation? And misinformation, once again, it can be unintentional. It can split communities apart also, but it has another kind of strange effect. And once again, this gets back to human tendency to build groups based on beliefs. Misinformation can actually build trust and unity around strange ideas. There used to not be a strong flat earth movement in the world, or strong forms of many other conspiracy theories, but thanks to the internet and social media, the folks who were once isolated individuals have been able to build trusting online communities, and these online communities have real world effects. So asking the purpose of misinformation is a bit of an odd question, because in one sense, it's a bit like asking the purpose of a piece of trash. In the information ecosystem where truth ought to be prized, misinformation ought to be tossed out. But as the saying goes, one person's trash is another person's treasure. So once again, because humans build trust based on shared beliefs, any beliefs, even a false one, can form a community. It's not so much about the idea as it is about the trust and the community that forms around that idea. And hearing that someone is one of us, for example, is a shortcut to trust. It means accept this person, they believe, fill in the blank like we do. And you've sometimes seen this happen. It can be, whatever the topic is, whatever the idea is. If a person is someone who holds that idea, then you consider them to be a part of your group, whether it is something political or religious or other ideas. So misinformation is a form of treasured trash. Community is a treasure, and I really want to emphasize that. Having a group of friends and people who you can talk to and that you trust is really a treasure. And it is a sad state of affairs where treasured communities form around trash, when ultimately you think about flat Earth theory or geocentrism or the idea that there are lizard people running the government. Those ideas are trash. I mean, just frankly. And yet they form these treasured communities around them. And I want us to think back in time to the 1970s. In the 1970s, there were cults. There were a lot of cults around, actually. It was kind of a strange period of time. Today, I think we can take a lot of those ideas around cults and transfer them to internet misinformation. The small picture down below is a picture of the Jonestown Massacre, which happened in the late 1970s. And these sorts of extreme cult behaviors eventually made people realize these religious movements are bad, and they're not only religious movements. Jonestown is very much an ideological movement more than just being a religious one. Now we're seeing these same things happening online, and the effects are getting worse. And I think one of the things we need to realize here is that American culture and cultures around the world have all been disrupted by a lot of disturbances to civil society. In other words, our natural bonds to each other have been broken apart, and COVID has just broken them apart even more. We don't see other people as much as we used to. We don't see our friends at restaurants. We don't go to church where we can see each other. All these other opportunities to meet people and talk in real life have all been heavily damaged. COVID just makes it all worse, but these trends have been very long-term, going all the way back to, decades ago. But these things, I mean, they're very powerful trends. And right now we have to deal with a new trend. In other words, people are looking for these communities. They need something to fill that vacuum. This power vacuum has been opened up, or social vacuum, and they're looking for a way to fill it. And they're going to pick anything, whether it's pathological or not. So this really raises the question of what do we do? And what we do is we need to have a restoration of trust. And a restoration of trust really requires a restoration of trustworthiness. And it really requires us to think about what it means to be worthy of trust. What does that mean? At least in some sense, it means to meet one's duties, to respect others, to keep others' best interests in mind. Very, very ethical ideas. One of the reasons that I think people are talking so much about ethics these days is because ethics is a genuine problem. We've lost a lot of our historical sources of thinking about how we form communities and how we treat each other and relate to each other. So we have to now be more intentional about it. We have to think about ethics and what are the further ramifications of our actions. Not only that, the world's also become much more complicated. So shared beliefs are one way that we can help restore trust. So for example, the US Constitution and the idea of forming a more perfect union, there's an ideal built in to the US Constitution that goes back to the origin of our country, that together we're trying to build something even better than we've had before. There are other American ideals like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There are universal ethical ideas like kindness, caring, and compassion. And this requires a renewal or a creation of widely shared beliefs and values. Political authorities can help with this, but they can't lead it, is another thing I would say. Because the political area has become so polarized, we need other forms of authority to really step in and kind of take this first step. Political authorities can help, but they can't lead. So moral authorities do exist, the Pope being one. And I say that because, of course, not only the Pope, but there are many other sources of authority in the world. They're not necessarily people either. They can be documents, books, ideas, philosophies, and so on. However, there's a problem because morality is exactly the point in dispute. There's no universal shared moral authority. And without that universal shared moral authority, we have a problem, which is that we can't unify around it. However, there are widely shared ideas across all of these sources of moral authority. So for example, kindness, caring, compassion, honesty, those sorts of things are widely shared. But if we don't think broadly enough, if we only think about our own group and keep those values that are supposed to be universal values only aimed inwardly, they can also be very destructive. So these values are rooted in humanity. Human nature itself can be a good source of these things. So for example, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from the United Nations. There are also human virtues, ideas of a good person. And there are some very near universal values as we've been talking about so far. So the flood of misinformation and disinformation is threatening to swamp reality. Communities being broken apart and how has culture responded? Now, this is something that's very, very interesting, and coming at this from a perspective of religion, I think can yield some insights here. Cancel culture is really just a form of heresy. Heretics are punished or seeking out and destroying heresy. So heretics are punished with expulsion from the community. They're ostracized, excommunicated. And so we have to ask ourselves, if this spirit is returning, then is there some sort of value in the older intolerant Catholic tradition that error has no rights? And you might think of that and say, oh, hold on a second. That was not good. There was a lot of reasons that people moved away from that. And yet we're doing it kind of naturally as secular society is skated towards this. So down at the bottom there is Pope Pius IX waving high. So we're in kind of a precarious balance here between freedom of expression. You can think about that with Mark Zuckerberg on one side. Facebook is all about freedom of expression. And then the error has no rights on the other side, which is kind of typified by Pope Pius IX. There's got to be a happy medium between those two extremes. Freedom of expression respects human dignity, and yet it permits the flow of misinformation and disinformation. And so the picture of Vladimir Putin down there, he's very happy with that. Suppression protects beliefs and group coherence, which is great for those groups, but it also harms individuals and causes groupthink and stasis. So we need a middle course. And so I offered John Courtney Murray up there at the top, who of course helped to reconcile these issues in the Catholic Church. So what can technology do? There's no simple solutions. Some of the starts are in content moderation. You turn up good content and turn down bad content. Emphasize shared values, emphasize unity in diversity. And then of course there has to be enforcement. Violating the norms needs to have a cost. And of course these platforms include YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. Twitter and Facebook tend to get a lot of the news, but really YouTube should not be forgotten. YouTube has definitely failed in a lot of this content moderation. So what can we do? Be vigilant, as everyone has said before. Remember, the US is particularly targeted. Think holistically about new information. We've had, everyone so far has talked about that also. Try not to spend more time online than in real life. I think this is one of the things. People were talking about Thanksgiving and the family Thanksgiving. You need to prize those in-person relationships, even if there are painful experiences about being there. Think about friends or family who are taken in by conspiracy theories as being drawn into a cult. It's not their fault. There's just something in their life that cult is meeting a need for. The number one rule with cults is to maintain the relationship. You have to take care about them, maintain that care, and help them come back ultimately when they're ready. Form real relationships and communities with good people. And of course, try to be a good person yourself. Change begins with us. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to Jerry.
Well, thank you very much. That was really quite a splendid presentation, Brian, on a whole range of topics, but clustering around the idea of building communities of trust. And, the components of being together you've described, I sometimes wonder, it's a little bit like Humpty Dumpty. Are we already in, a dystopian society? Has social media broken us apart? And if it has, it seems to me your communities of trust is the glue to bring us back together. That's how I'm hearing you come across. But I'm wanting to ask you a question that has been creating a chain through the attendees chat box. And that is, it comes around the function of profit or money making, whether it be about the big social media companies or else our own individual drive in our own life to earn more money and to use the various social platforms to do that. What's your sense? I mean, do you have a sense of connecting the sort of dystopia that you're describing through misinformation and disinformation and lying with, can that be related to the drive for profit in these large social media companies?
There's definitely a connection there, right? One of the reasons social media companies are reluctant to moderate their content is because that content represents money to them. And moderating that content not only costs money in terms of the moderation, it also costs money in terms of the eyeballs who are looking at your platform. And as long as their business models are centered around having eyeballs watching your content, then even misinformation and disinformation, because it brings eyeballs to watch your content, is valuable to those social media platforms. And that's why they really have to step back and say, is this the world that we want to live in, where we have all been fractured and had our minds manipulated by misinformation and disinformation? Once they take that step back, they realize that they need to be doing this. This is the right thing. And these companies talk to us at the Markkula Center. I work with them. They know this is a problem, and yet because the incentives are set up in such a difficult way, it's hard for them to make the right choice.
That's a great observation. And in terms, Brian, of what someone was saying earlier, one of the presenters earlier on this theme about these companies having to work together, it's not just within their company or their corporation. So I'm wondering, insofar as you're suggesting that their fiduciary responsibility has to be enhanced, they've got to have a greater sense of building trust among the communities they serve and between the communities with which they are corporate, competitors. So given the fact that it seems unlikely they're going to make much progress, is this going to be a role for government?
So I don't want to be too skeptical about their ability to solve the problems. Although they've been spinning their wheels for many years now, the wheels are starting to get traction. It's taken them a while. And I think a lot of it's come from, interestingly enough, social pressure within their own social networks, right? Other tech people have looked at these tech people who are at these certain platforms and said, hey, you're giving us all a bad name. Would you stop it? You're making us look bad. And that type of social pressure actually can generate results. Is there a step for government? Yes, also absolutely. However, everyone's very reluctant to have government step in, even government itself, because they don't want to squash innovation, especially when there's international competition at stake here. And so, for example, the European Union has been kind of at the forefront of regulation because they don't feel like they have a giant AI company that is their own company that they need to be protecting. They see, the big AI companies in the US and the big AI companies in China, and they say, fine, neither of them are us. We can regulate them here because we're not harming ourselves. However, they would really like to have their own AI companies in Europe. And so they don't want to squash innovation. They don't want to cause these bad things to happen. And so it's very much a delicate balance of how do we make sure that we have our own AI champions, because ultimately AI it's a national security technology in a lot of ways. It's involved in surveillance. It's involved in the way information flows. Those are really important things to consider. And yet with these negative effects, there has to be some way to regulate it at the same time.
Brian, we have room for just one more question before we go on. And I see in the chat feed several items that relate back to your friend Aristotle. So let me ask you that question of the relationship between truth and values and technology and performance. It's quite clear that you're suggesting that the communities of trust are about building us, our virtue, our character. I can assume that's what you're certainly meaning by that. But to what extent, so my question is not so much that's the Thanksgiving piece, that we can foster communities through character and virtue. But what about fostering virtue in organizations? Can we begin to think of these big social media organizations as potentially virtuous organizations, using Aristotle on techne and wisdom?
So this is a fantastic question. This is exactly what the Markkula Center and other organizations are trying to do when they're working with technology companies. And some technology companies have really tried to take a lead on this. So for example, Microsoft really has tried to start staking their reputation on trust. And that tone is set from the top. So people say, look, it's Satya Nadella and it's Brad Smith, and they really changed the way that our corporate culture works when they came in here and started saying, look, trust and ethics, these are very, very important, prized values for us. Other corporations, let me back up a step. Older corporations, I think, figure this out more easily because they've been around longer, they have more experience. Just like young people have less experience, they have less ability to figure out how they're supposed to interact with the world because they lack that experience. Even if you're a very good person, if you don't have that experience, you don't know how to apply your ethical rules to reality. And I think the same thing can be said of technology companies. Their culture builds after a while. They gain experience, bad things happen to them. They can choose to learn from those bad things. Then they can also cover their ears and eyes, right? And choose not to see what's happening. And when that happens, it's bad for everybody because you really need these large, powerful companies to be paying attention and trying to make the world a better place. Some of the companies are taking a lead. Some of the companies are in the middle of the pack, and some of the, they're more behind.
Brian, thank you ever so much for an utterly mesmerizing presentation and really exciting discussion. Thank you. I'm going to pass this back now to Darlene.